The messages slowly become shorter. The warmth begins to disappear. The explanations fade away. And one day the person who once gave you endless chances becomes impossible to reach, like a locked room with no entrance left. Because here is the frightening truth most people never fully understand. An empath emotionally leaves long before they physically walk away. In behavioral psychology, this is known as emotional withdrawal. It happens when the brain notices repeated emotional pain and slowly starts shutting down attachment pathways to protect itself from further damage. The same neural systems connected to physical pain become active during emotional betrayal. Research from the University of Michigan discovered that rejection and emotional hurt activate the anterior cingulate cortex, the exact same area connected to physical injury. For an empath, toxic behavior does not simply hurt emotions. Their brain reacts to it almost like physical harm. And once the nervous system decides someone is emotionally unsafe, something irreversible quietly begins. At first, the empath tries even harder. They communicate more. They explain themselves again and again. They forgive things they should never forgive. They carry entire conversations by themselves. They overthink every interaction, trying to bring emotional peace back into the relationship. Because empaths are often conflict avoidant, not because they are weak, but because they feel everything deeply. Studies involving mirror neurons suggest highly empathetic people process the emotions of others almost as if those emotions belong to them personally. That means arguments drain them faster. Negativity affects them more deeply. Emotional coldness cuts them more painfully. But this is where most people make the biggest mistake. They confuse patience with permanence. They believe the empath will always stay. They care too much to leave. They will forgive again. And that is exactly how people lose empaths forever. Because every ignored emotion becomes emotional evidence. Every betrayal becomes silent data. Every disrespectful moment gets recorded quietly inside the nervous system. Empaths rarely explode without warning. They slowly fade after long accumulation. Psychologists call this cumulative emotional overload. It happens when stress hormones like cortisol stay elevated for too long because of unresolved emotional tension. Eventually, the empath's brain shifts from attachment mode into self-protection mode. And once that switch happens, something colder starts replacing compassion. Clarity. Suddenly, they stop defending your actions. They stop making excuses for your behavior. They stop trying to heal wounds only you can heal yourself. This is the stage most people fail to notice because the empath still appears calm on the outside. But internally, the connection is already dying. And here is the most dangerous part. When an empath finally stops reacting, it often means they have already detached emotionally. The silence is not weakness. It is closure happening quietly in real time. Neuroscience shows emotional burnout changes behavior in dramatic ways. A person who once chased connection starts avoiding emotional stimulation completely. The empath who once wrote long paragraphs now answers with a single sentence. The person who once begged to fix things suddenly looks emotionally distant. Not because they stopped caring overnight, but because caring became too psychologically expensive. Therapists often repeat a powerful phrase. The opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference. And nothing feels more frightening than an empath becoming indifferent. Because once they truly detach, they rarely return as the same person again. You see, empaths usually have an extremely high tolerance for pain, not because they enjoy suffering, but because they naturally prioritize understanding over self-protection. They try to see the wounded child inside everyone. the hidden trauma, the insecurity behind toxic behavior. But eventually the brain asks one brutal question: who is protecting me? And when the answer becomes nobody, the empath changes. This transformation is not cruelty, it is psychological survival. The nervous system starts reducing emotional investment to conserve energy. The empath stops offering their heart to places where it is repeatedly mishandled. And the shocking truth is that most people only realize how important the empath was after the emotional support disappears. Because empaths give people things modern psychology identifies as basic emotional needs: validation, safety, presence, deep listening, emotional stability. They calm entire rooms without anyone noticing. They absorb tension other people create. They carry relationships emotionally in silence, while nobody realizes how heavy the burden has become. Most people believe an empath leaves because of one final fight, one betrayal, or one disrespectful moment. But psychology reveals something far darker. Empaths almost never leave because of one event. They leave because their nervous system can no longer survive the accumulation. Every ignored feeling, every broken promise, every moment they felt emotionally abandoned while standing beside someone they deeply loved. The brain remembers all of it. Science now shows that the human nervous system stores emotional pain with frightening accuracy. Researchers using brain scans discovered that social rejection activates the same neural circuitry involved in physical injury. The anterior cingulate cortex, the region linked to physical pain, lights up when someone feels emotionally rejected. To an empath, repeated emotional hurt is not overreacting. It is biological stress. And the terrifying part is that the damage builds quietly over time. Empaths are often highly sensitive emotional processors. Their minds absorb emotional environments like sponges absorb water. Research on sensory processing sensitivity suggests certain people react much more intensely to emotional tension, conflict, and negativity. Their cortisol levels rise faster. Their emotional recovery takes longer. This means what another person quickly forgets, an empath may carry inside for weeks. One cold comment, one humiliating moment, one night of emotional neglect. It stays inside their nervous system long after everyone else has forgotten it ever happened. But empaths rarely speak about the pain immediately. Instead, they do something psychologists consider dangerous. They rationalize it. He is stressed. She did not mean it. They have been through a lot. And while they continue understanding everyone else, nobody notices the empath slowly disappearing internally. Because emotional overload does not happen like an explosion. It happens like water slowly filling a locked room until eventually there is no oxygen left. The human body was never designed to survive under constant emotional stress. When someone repeatedly feels emotionally unsafe, the brain increases production of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Over time, this affects memory, sleep, digestion, immunity, and even heart health. Harvard researchers have connected prolonged emotional stress to inflammation throughout the body. Inflammation that quietly damages organs, weakens the immune system, and speeds up aging. This means some empaths are not simply emotionally exhausted. Their bodies are physically suffering from carrying emotional pain nobody else can see. And the heartbreaking part is that they usually hide it extremely well. They still smile. They still help people. They still answer messages. They still show up for everyone, while internally their nervous system is screaming for relief. That is why empaths often seem perfectly fine right before they disappear forever. The breakdown happened long before the exit itself. Psychologists call this emotional exhaustion syndrome. It happens when a person becomes psychologically drained from long-term emotional labor and unresolved stress. The brain eventually starts shutting down emotional responsiveness to survive. And this is the moment people misunderstand empaths the most. Because suddenly the empath changes. The person who once over-explained becomes silent. The person who once fought for the relationship stops arguing completely. The person who once cried now stares quietly into space with no reaction at all. Most people think the empath stopped caring. In reality, the nervous system has entered survival mode. There is a frightening psychological condition called learned helplessness. It happens when repeated emotional disappointment convinces the brain that effort no longer changes anything. After enough pain, the empath unconsciously stops trying. Not because they are weak, but because the brain believes more effort will only create more suffering. That is why the final stage before an empath leaves is often emotional numbness. And numbness is dangerous. Because when someone reaches the point where pain no longer shocks them, detachment begins to feel peaceful. At first, the empath still hopes things can improve. They communicate carefully. They explain their feelings gently. They ask for emotional honesty. They try to save the relationship quietly, without demanding too much. But every ignored conversation slowly teaches the nervous system another painful lesson. Your feelings are not safe here. And once the brain fully learns that lesson, something changes forever. The empath slowly stops reaching out, stops expecting understanding, stops hoping for emotional safety from the same person who repeatedly created emotional pain. What looks like distance on the outside is often self-protection happening internally. People are usually shocked when the empath finally leaves because they mistake endurance for endless tolerance. They believe someone who forgives deeply will stay forever. But what they fail to understand is that forgiveness and emotional access are not the same thing. An empath may forgive you internally and still never allow you close to their heart again. Because eventually survival becomes stronger than attachment. And once an empath reaches that point, their energy completely changes. They no longer argue for connection. They no longer beg to be understood. They no longer chase closure from people who repeatedly wounded them. The emotional door quietly closes. And the frightening part is this: most people do not notice the door closing until they try to come back inside and realize it is permanently locked. By then, the empath has already grieved the relationship silently, already cried the tears in private, already mourned the future they once hoped for. Long before they physically leave, they emotionally prepare themselves to survive without you. That is why, when an empath finally walks away, it often looks calm. No screaming, no dramatic revenge, no chaos, just silence, distance, absence. But underneath that silence is usually years of emotional pain the nervous system could no longer carry. And once an empath experiences peace after leaving emotional chaos, something powerful happens psychologically. The brain begins associating distance with safety. The nervous system finally relaxes. Sleep improves. Anxiety decreases. The constant emotional tension disappears. For the first time in a long time, the empath feels what safety actually feels like. And once someone experiences that kind of peace, it becomes very difficult to return to environments that once destroyed them emotionally. That is why empaths rarely return after true detachment, because the version of them that tolerated endless pain no longer exists. They ask for consistency, reassurance, and respect, not because they are needy, but because emotional safety is a real human need. Neuroscientists have discovered that stable emotional connection helps regulate the nervous system itself. Healthy relationships can lower blood pressure, reduce stress hormones, and strengthen emotional resilience. But toxic emotional inconsistency creates the exact opposite effect. One day there is affection, the next day distance. One moment there is intimacy, the next moment rejection. This creates what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, one of the most emotionally addictive patterns that can exist. It is the same reward system connected to gambling addiction.
The unpredictability traps the empath emotionally. They continue hoping the loving version of that person will finally return for good. But over time, their nervous system becomes exhausted from all the instability. And once that exhaustion reaches a certain point, something changes forever. The empath stops expecting love to feel safe. That realization breaks something deep inside them. Imagine waking up one day and understanding that the person you protected the most is also the person draining your nervous system the most. That realization changes people permanently because empaths can survive pain. What destroys them is realizing their love keeps being mishandled by someone fully aware of how sensitive they are. And once that awareness enters the empath's mind, emotional withdrawal begins moving very quickly. The texts become shorter. The eye contact feels different. The warmth slowly fades, not because of revenge, but because of self-preservation. Research on trauma responses shows that emotional withdrawal is often the brain trying to reduce psychological danger. The empath is unconsciously trying to prevent more emotional damage. This is why many empaths isolate themselves after long, toxic relationships. Their nervous system becomes extremely sensitive. Loud places exhaust them. Conversations drain their energy. Even small disagreements begin to feel overwhelming. Their body has stayed in survival mode for too long. And the saddest part is that many empaths blame themselves while this is happening. They think they are too emotional, too sensitive, or too difficult to love, when in reality, their brain is reacting exactly how any human nervous system reacts to long periods of emotional stress. The empath was never weak. They were overloaded, and overload changes people. Studies show that chronic emotional stress can shrink the hippocampus, the part of the brain connected to memory and emotional regulation. It can increase anxiety disorders, panic attacks, insomnia, and depression. Some empaths are literally becoming physically sick while trying to maintain relationships that constantly wound them emotionally. That is why the disappearance eventually becomes necessary, not dramatic, necessary. The empath reaches a frightening realization inside themselves. If I stay here, I will completely lose who I am. And when survival finally becomes stronger than attachment, they quietly walk away. Not because they stopped loving, but because eventually the body forces the soul to choose between connection and survival. And in the end, survival always wins. That is why people who lose empaths are often shocked. They say things like, "You changed, you became cold, you gave up too fast." But they never saw the invisible psychological battle happening inside the empath for months or even years. They never saw the sleepless nights, the anxiety attacks, the endless overthinking, or the silent crying behind closed doors. They only noticed the empath leaving. They never noticed the slow, emotional destruction that made leaving necessary. And by the time the empath finally walks away, something irreversible has already happened. Their nervous system has learned one brutal lesson. Peace feels safer than attachment. And once an empath truly learns that lesson, they rarely return to the people who taught it to them. The most dangerous moment in a relationship is not the screaming, not the arguments, not even the betrayal. It is the silence. Because when an empath becomes silent, something psychological has already died inside them. Most people completely misunderstand this stage. They think the empath is calming down, giving space, or taking time to think. But neuroscience suggests something much deeper is happening.
The human brain can only tolerate emotional disappointment for so long before it starts protecting itself through detachment. And for empaths, that detachment almost never happens loudly. It happens quietly and slowly, like a candle losing oxygen inside a sealed room. At first, the empath reacts emotionally because they still believe the relationship can be saved. They explain themselves over and over again. They communicate patiently. They analyze every conflict deeply, searching for emotional resolution. Why? Because highly empathetic people often have stronger emotional monitoring systems. Studies involving mirror neurons suggest that empaths process the emotions of other people with unusual intensity. Their nervous systems absorb emotional tension faster and deeper than most people realize. That means arguments do not just upset them, they drain them biologically. One cold interaction can replay in their mind for days. One dismissive comment can trigger hours of emotional processing. Their brain keeps searching for emotional safety because emotional harmony feels necessary for survival. But eventually, something frightening begins happening inside the empath's nervous system. They stop believing their feelings matter. And psychology has a name for this: emotional learned helplessness. It happens when repeated emotional invalidation teaches the brain that expressing pain changes nothing. So the nervous system adapts by shutting down emotional output completely. That is why an empath becoming quiet is never random. Silence is often the final stage of emotional exhaustion. The empath realizes that no matter how clearly they explain their pain, nothing changes. And once the brain reaches that conclusion, behavior changes dramatically. The long paragraphs disappear. The late-night conversations stop. Emotional vulnerability slowly fades away. Suddenly, the person who once begged to fix everything barely reacts anymore. This confuses people deeply because humans expect pain to look emotional. But the deepest pain often looks emotionally empty. Research in trauma psychology shows that emotional numbing is a protective defense mechanism. When stress becomes overwhelming, the brain reduces emotional responsiveness to minimize more psychological damage. This means the empath's silence is not peace, it is survival. And the most chilling part is this: by the time this silence appears externally, the emotional bond may already be collapsing internally. Because empaths rarely detach impulsively. They detach after long periods of emotional disappointment. Every broken promise becomes neurological evidence. Every invalidated feeling weakens trust pathways inside the brain. Every moment of emotional neglect quietly trains the nervous system to stop expecting safety from that person. Over time, the empath stops reacting not because they no longer care, but because caring became psychologically dangerous. Think about that for a moment. Imagine loving someone so deeply that eventually your nervous system identifies that love itself as a source of stress. That changes a human being permanently. Studies show that chronic emotional stress increases cortisol production. When cortisol stays elevated for too long, it affects memory, concentration, sleep, digestion, immune function, and even heart health. This means some empaths are not only emotionally hurt, their bodies are physically reacting to relationship instability as if they are surviving a long-term threat. And eventually the nervous system begins conserving energy. This is when silence becomes strangely comforting. No more explaining, no more emotional chasing, no more fighting just to feel understood. The empath discovers something shocking. Silence hurts less than disappointment. And once they discover that, emotional detachment accelerates rapidly. People often mistake this phase for emotional coldness. But emotionally exhausted people are not cold.
They are depleted. The empath once cared so deeply that they ignored their own psychological limits. They tolerated inconsistency, mixed signals, emotional neglect, and disrespect disguised as misunderstanding because they kept hoping empathy would eventually heal the relationship. But empathy without mutual effort becomes self-destruction, and eventually the human nervous system rebels against self-destruction. That rebellion looks like distance. Suddenly the empath no longer reacts to arguments, no longer begs for reassurance, and no longer asks for honesty. Why? Because emotionally they are already grieving the relationship while still inside it. Psychologists describe grief as the process of emotionally adapting to loss.
What many people fail to realize is that empaths often begin grieving long before the relationship officially ends. They mourn the emotional connection slowly, quietly, internally. Every disappointment becomes another funeral for the version of the relationship they once believed in. And eventually the silence arrives, not as punishment, but as acceptance. This is why the empath's final silence feels so haunting, because there is no visible explosion attached to it. One day they simply stop reaching emotionally, and that moment terrifies people. Because deep down they realize something important. The empath did not suddenly stop caring. They slowly ran out of emotional strength after carrying the weight of the relationship alone for far too long. The terrifying part is that most people notice the empath's absence only after the empath has emotionally disappeared internally. By the time the empath becomes distant externally, they have usually spent countless nights fighting internal battles nobody ever saw. They replayed conversations in their mind. They questioned themselves endlessly. They searched for ways to save the connection without losing themselves completely. But eventually the nervous system reaches a limit. Human beings are not designed to survive endless emotional uncertainty without consequences. And once the empath crosses that invisible emotional line, something changes permanently inside them. The same person who once begged for communication now values silence more than explanation. The same person who once chased emotional closeness now protects their peace at all costs. Not because they became heartless, but because their nervous system finally understood that constant emotional pain cannot be normalized forever. This is why the empath's silence feels heavier than anger. Anger still carries emotional energy. Silence often means the emotional energy is gone. The empath is no longer trying to fix the connection because psychologically they have already accepted the loss. And when someone reaches that stage, return becomes very rare.